Hey everyone, welcome to the show Off the Record. In this episode, I am today speaking with Rachel Zimmer. This is episode number 20 of Off the Record. A little background on Rachel. She's a leader in the Toronto tech community, and she's incredibly passionate about accelerating entrepreneurship in the Canadian ecosystem. Currently, Rachel is the general manager of Entrepreneur First in Toronto. It's the world's leading talent investor. EF brings together extraordinary people to build startups from scratch in London, Singapore, Berlin, Hong Kong, Paris, India, and as of September 2020, Toronto, which Rachel is part of. Through its $140 million fund, EF invests in individuals to find a world-class founder, develop an idea, and fund the technology businesses that they create. Prior to EF, Rachel coached over 50 startups as an entrepreneur in residence at Ryerson's incubator called the Digital Media Zone, or short for DMZ. And before coaching startups, she co-founded, scaled, and exited a company called Five Crowd, all in under 3 years. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Rachel, it's awesome having you on our show. Thanks so much for joining today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Cool. Start off on a personal side. I know that you're a Second City grad, among other things. Just curious, how does that experience of acting, affect your character, from a professional perspective?
My gosh, if you ask my team, they'll be like, there's drama and role playing in everything we do. But no, jokes aside, I think it's a passion area of mine. I went to, school for performing arts growing up, took drama in different ways, through post-secondary. But I think the biggest takeaway for me and how it relates to business is you always need to be performing. No matter what it is, no matter who you're in front of, and you always need to really understand your audience to put on a good show. So I'd say that core principle in acting and drama is something that is obviously very core and important in the business world. So that's probably the biggest lesson that translates well.
Interesting. Yeah. And as a former CEO and founder, I'm sure, as a CEO, and I'm sure when you coach other startups, the CEO is really much the face of a company. And how they present themselves, reflect themselves, and the character which they display publicly or even internally in a team really helps in my opinion, makes the success of a company in many ways. So talking about kind of, you working now with EF and then your prior experience at the DMZ, having come across, those 50 companies, if not more, you obviously have a lot of exposure and experience working with entrepreneurs. What now in your role, at EF as a general manager, what do you wish entrepreneurs would ask you, but they rarely do?
It's a really good question and a hard question. And I think I'll answer it with this, which is often I'll meet with teams for a variety of things, whether it's sales help or marketing help. And very rarely will a founder at the end of that meeting say, hey, and here's my ask of you, Rachel. And I always think about it as such a lost opportunity, whether it's asking for an intro to a customer, asking for an intro to potential talent. So I guess, my wish for entrepreneurs is have that tenacity that in every single meeting, you're getting something to move your ship forward. And so I guess it's just as simple as that. I wish there were more asks because I'm happy to help. And then on the flip side, I want them to just be maximizing their time so they can do the best thing they can for their business.
And why do you think that they hold back, or they don't go for those asks and are a bit more, not aggressive, but demanding, I guess, in terms of things that they need or help for, but they just basically don't want to overextend the person or look bad because they don't know the answer, or they need help?
So my best guess at it is that I actually think a lot of people don't isolate, say, hey, these are the 3 things I really need to be focusing on with my team. And once you're really clear on your focus areas, it's easy to ask for help. But I actually think the root issue is a bit more existential and core, that sometimes teams don't actually know what their core focus areas are. And then it's not obvious that at the end of every meeting, okay, I either need something to help with customers, talent, or on my product. These are the ways I could be asking for help, and then going out and doing that. So I think that's my best guess for what the root issue is.
Talking about team dynamics, let's talk about co-founders. I know you previously mentioned to me that, talking about co-founder problems is something that kept coming up a lot in a lot of conversations that you had when you were coaching and mentoring them, at the DMZ and maybe other places. But why do you think it's such a challenge? Let's start there in terms of, you know, understanding or, as a startup, how you get involved with your co-founders and some of the challenges that you need to navigate through and address as you're building a company.
You know, if you drill down to what a co-founder relationship is, you have reputational risk, financial risk, legal risk, and it's someone or individuals you're going to be spending tens of thousands of hours with. And so when you
Mm-hmm.
think of the weight of that kind of decision making of who you're going to be engaging with as a co-founder, it's
Mm-hmm.
arguably more serious and more intense than a spouse because of the amount of weight that comes with that. So I think just kind of calling out how hard it is that it is kind of the first step, right? I think the second thing is people are attracted to working people like them, and that's often not the best co-founder to be working with.
Mm-hmm.
And so now at Entrepreneur First, what we pride ourselves on is we help people find their ideal co-founder. And so we bring people together from all walks of life. We ensure the quality bar is really high. But part of the goal is that, if two people went to the same program, went to the same school, and had thought in the same way, quite often they'll end up founding together. But is that the optimal pairing? Or someone that comes from a totally different background with a totally different set of life experiences and maybe a shared set of values? That's probably pretty important.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of assessment piece, I think, it's just outside of people's networks, and then
Mm-hmm.
secondarily, the human instinct is to gravitate toward people like them. So now at EF, I have a lot of fun bringing exceptional people together and kind of just letting the magic happen and seeing people meet each other and identifying who they think would be a great co-founder.
Interesting. And how do you like? I feel like in many ways it's kind of like matchmaking, right? What does that matchmaking look like? Like, how do you look for traits between one co-founder, another co-founder that haven't met, but you know that they are there and that they're interested in something? And what makes you want to connect those two people together?
So we actually don't say, hey, like Aram and Rachel, you guys should be co-founders. All we do is we put the 50 amazing people in a room, and then we put a lot of
Interesting.
frameworks
Okay.
and experiments together to see people kind of try and
Gel.
test and gel and try working with each
Yeah.
other. But however, with that being said, once the cohort does start, in the back of our minds, we do think like, okay, here are 5 people that could be amazing for or here are 10 people that could be amazing for this other person. So if
Mm-hmm.
they're having problems kind of figuring out who they gel with, we can point them in the direction and say, hey, have you talked to this person? We think they could be great. But to answer your question on the traits, what I can speak to on the behavioral side, we look for the same thing on CTOs and CEOs. And it's really 3 core things. The first is, do they have this crazy, relentless drive to achieve? This hunger to win, that grittiness, that resilience, that no matter what, they find a way to make it work. I mean, as an entrepreneur, I'm like, you get punched in the face while chewing glass. Like that's essentially what the entrepreneurial experience is, right? And so you need to have shown that you can go through, you've done that in different parts, whether personal or professional in your life. So that's drive to achieve. And then I won't go into as much detail on the other 2, but it's followership that we look at, and then this outlier trait of challenging convention. So we find that if we find really good examples across those 3, we can, with pretty good confidence, have a great quality cohort.
Mm-hmm. And I know at Entrepreneur First, you really try to, when you're looking at co-founders, between 2 or 3, what is your perspective on that? Like, I know you think 2 is enough. I'd love to know, why do you think it's enough, and how do you kind of differentiate and challenge that type of thinking?
Yeah, look, like my opinion on this comes from 2 places. One is having been a founder with one other co-founder, but we did have a dynamic of 3 a couple times, and it was really, really hard. So I've
Mm-hmm.
got personal experience of the challenges with it. And then now at EF, there's a pretty strong opinion that teams of 2 are poised to have the greatest success. Everything from communication. So if you've got 2 people, it's really easy to be communicating and simpatico on things versus as soon as you add 3, or add another to make it 3, all of a sudden you've got asynchronous communication where, you know, 2 people might connect on something and then one person's left behind,
Right.
and then vice versa. And then often what ends up happening is a bit of a 2-on-1. And the 2-on-1, whether socially or in a business setting, is never fun. And so, you know, from a social dynamic standpoint, that's where I guess that part comes from. And I think outside of that, you know, the EF perspective is it's so much to try and do out the gate starting a company. You need to test your co-founder relationship. You need to pressure test a problem, come up with a solution, test the solution, to now add this like crazy social dynamic on top of it where there's like confusion and power and decision making.
Yeah.
It's possible. We've invested in 3s before, but that's definitely a riskier investment for us, and definitely one that we usually ask some tough questions before we make that call.
Mm-hmm. And just going back to your, experience at Five Crowd, how was that? I mean, what was your kind of learnings there in your journey you went through as one of the co-founders?
Yeah, I really, when I look back at our experience, I think the relationship I had with my co-founder is one of the greatest strengths to our business success. Bram and I drive each other batshit crazy. We have a lot of fun, but ultimately we are super complementary and challenge each other.
Mm-hmm.
And if Bram's on something, I know it'll be great. It's like, cool, Bram's got it, boom. And then on the flip side, you know, he feels the same. And the way we actually divided roles and responsibilities was super unusual, but it really worked for us. I led the business, team reported into me, and then once a week I would sit down with Bram and I had a Google Doc that said shit that keeps me up at night. And Bram would sit down with me and he'd be like, okay, what are the 5? What are the 5 this week? And we'd run through them and he'd be like, cool, I'm picking this one. It'll be off your list by next week. And so he would just pluck them off, and then week by week we would go through it. And the way we summarize it is like I was working in the business, like building it, driving revenue, hiring, building the product, and then Bram was
Mm-hmm.
working on the business, like taking
Mm-hmm.
different pieces that were stressing me out, and then working on the business to make it much stronger long term.
I really love that, in the business, on the business. It's something that I came across when I was, I think, at the Fireside conference, the retreat. And I came across this CEO who runs a couple publicly traded companies, and I told him about all my problems, and he's like, it looks like that you're working in the business too much. You're not working on the business too much. So how did you go about separating out those things with Bram? Um, because I mean, as a CEO, I'm sure, you want to work on the business. You can't always be in the business. How did you know what things to, delegate out, or what things he could take on, and and obviously you would trust him to do those requests.
It's so hard. It was really case by case, but I think one example of one where we both worked on the business versus in the business was anytime we had friction, we realized that we weren't aligned at the highest level. So, for example, if I was ready to sign a client and Bram's like, Rachel, why are
Mm,
we taking that client on? It's totally off our use case. It's going to mean we're going to need to totally pivot how we're building our product. I'm like, yeah, but money. See the dollar signs? Like, let's bring it here. So that kind of friction, it actually
yeah.
wasn't about the client. It wasn't about the contract. It was actually, if you take it up a level, we weren't aligned on what kind of business we were building. And
Hmm.
so that's an example of one where it wasn't like, okay, Bram, go figure out what kind of business we're building. It's like, okay, together, what's the vision of our company? What do we want to be when we grow up? What's the mission that's going to take
Yeah.
us there over the next 2 years? And so that's an example of one where we both did that, got to a really good place. And then all of a sudden, those day to day, do we sign this client? Do we go after this kind of client? That was all within the framework that had been set.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, there was no framework like 2 by 2 of like, if this, go here, if that, go there. Unfortunately.
It's never ever that straightforward. I
Yeah.
wish it was, but it's not. Um, Going back to your experience now with EF, or just in general, I'm curious. As an entrepreneur, if I have an idea first, uh, instead of finding a partner first to work with, how do you go about picking your co-founder? Assuming I have an idea, I'm maybe a subject matter expert in what I do around this idea, and I see there's an opportunity, but I don't know how to execute it. I don't know how to find my co-founder. What kind of things would you recommend?
So I guess I'll take a bit of a contrarian view, which
Okay.
is um, I buy in big time, obviously, with EF and with my experience, that having a co founder is a better path than trying to go it alone. Having
Hmm.
a co founder means you've got someone emotionally good to go through the highs and lows with. And, and one person's down thinking the business is over, the other person can bring that positivity and pull you up. Especially at the beginning, each person brings their own set of knowledges and experiences, and ideally, that's IP in itself with the two founders. So
Yeah.
I guess I'm a big believer in a duo versus solo founder. Obviously, there's exceptions to the rule, but if I were to do it, I'd want to be, have a co-founder. And then if you buy into, okay, you want to have a co-founder, the second piece is, okay, if one person has the idea and the other person is joining, my observation with EF, and it's quite interesting, is it actually never works. And if one person brings the idea, it's their idea. Instead of, if you bring a problem and say, hey, this is a huge issue in the industry. I've started thinking about how to solve it, but like
Hmm.
if you and I were brainstorming, if I brought this problem, you'd say, ooh, have you thought about this or have you seen that? And then if we build the solution together, it truly will be our shared baby of a business versus
Hmm.
my business that you happen to come join. And really, at that point, why are you not just an employee, right? Versus a
Right.
co-founder. So I guess, one, do you buy into co-founder? If yes, secondarily, I would not recommend pitching ideas. And what we see in our cohorts is that even though we preach this, when people join and they start pitching their idea, no one ever partners up with them because no one wants to work on someone else's idea.
It's really interesting because I went through the Founder Institute when it first came to Toronto. It was actually the first one in Canada, and Sunil, who runs it, he recommended that I come join it because I've known him before, and it's everybody's supposed to go in there with an idea, and if your idea doesn't make it over the next couple workshops or whatever, you then can pick who you want to maybe work with. And the problem with that, and I've very seldomly seen a success, as you mentioned, succeed, is that is somebody's idea that my idea failed. So I'm gonna, in order to stay in the program, I'm gonna tag along into somebody else's idea that, I have to, or, I don't have to, I could leave the program, but I'm gonna be invested in with what they're pitching. And it's got nothing to do with the problem. I could maybe resonate with the problem, when they're pitching it and like, okay, maybe I could get excited around, but somebody's already going with an idea. So it's to your point, like, it's risky in many ways. Um, where can you go and find co-founders or people to find similar problems to work around? Um, like, I'm sure with EF you have some strategies and some ways to connect people around it, but um, where are other places that you've seen success around people coming together on a problem and then building out an idea around it?
So I promise I'm not just saying this because I work for EF, but here's what I'll say. It's really hard to find someone that is ready to take the level of commitment of going full time, that is interested in the same problem space, that brings a complementary skill set, to yours. It's a really
Yeah.
hard person to find, right? And so I guess why I get really excited with Entrepreneur First and why I decided to join was,
Hmm.
I'll share an anecdote that really resonated with me. We had a second time founder join our first cohort. And I actually asked him, I was like, why do you need us? You've made a killing and you've done so well in your first startup. And he was like,
Hmm.
look, I did the first one alone. I don't want to do it again alone. I want to have a co founder in the second journey. And I've spent X number of months going to bad meetups, eating bad pizza. I don't want to keep doing that. He's like, if you can
So
curate
true.
an amazing, amazing group of people for me, like that's incredible, and there's very few places where you can find that. So I
Yeah.
hate to say entrepreneur first is the answer, but it kind of is, and that's
Mm.
why I was so excited and that
Interesting.
we were launching in North America, and why I'm still excited about the value prop.
Very cool. Very cool. Going on a personal tangent,
Yeah,
before I continue with some of the questions, I I found that you're a big fan of of game boards. Is that right?
I am.
And what's your favorite one?
Oh, I'm so competitive. So I'm the oldest of four kids, and I grew up with a lot of board games, and all of us are highly, highly competitive. So we usually play within the family. Otherwise, we don't make friends in a funny way. But the game I grew up playing was actually Scrabble, nerdily enough. So I played
Yeah.
every Saturday morning with my dad, and I actually still play with him now. It's a ton of fun, and I love geeking out to board games without shame.
And why Scrabble? Why not Battleship or Clue or anything else?
Oh, good question. I guess it's the strategic components. Like every game is so different. You know, my mind works really well to like rearrange letters, nerdily enough. And like chess, my partner is super into chess. And he can't understand why I can get more excited about it. But thinking 10 moves ahead versus thinking a few moves ahead and like playing
Yeah,
tactically where you're at, I guess that's why it clicks for me.
interesting. Cool,
What about
cool. Well,
you?
thank you.
You have one?
Uh, I like Monopoly.
Nice, nice.
It's the one that I have fun playing with my kids. With that and Battleship with my son.
Nice,
Um, Clue is also a big one in our household.
nice.
Yeah. My daughter's always curious and always trying to figure out who's lying or who's the killer with what weapon. So it's always a fun thing that we did during the pandemic, being locked up at home
Yeah.
for a couple months here in Spain. So game boards was something that we really leaned towards in order to keep us going through our days. Um, Going back to um, your journey with Five Crowds, I wanted to kind of ask some personal questions, if you don't mind. You went through an exit. You built a company, and some founders tell me that like 10 years is like the mark when you should exit a company after building it to a certain point. And that's kind of been like the sweet spot I keep hearing time and time again. Wanted to ask you, why did you decide to sell at that time?
Yeah, it's a very fair question. And you're right, personal, but I'm happy to share. We didn't have a timeline in mind. We were just looking for four things in life, and we agreed to our like personal assessment. Bram and I checked in with each other quite often to make sure we were delivering against the things. And the four things we really were optimizing for was fun. So like, is it fun day to day? Obviously, there's going to be not like 10 out of 10 days at that level. But overall, if you're going to spend 10 years of your life doing something, you want to enjoy it, right? So fun was
Hmm.
one. Profit, both for the business and for ourselves. We wanted to make sure that, if our market rate was X, that over time we were at least getting
Yeah,
that, right, in some way, shape, or form. So
right.
fun, profit, scale. So both of us love scale. And that's really how, for the fourth thing that we care about, impact. Scale can get impact. If you can have a really meaningful, drive on a high number of people, you can then drive impact in the world in a meaningful
Hmm.
way. So those are the four things we were
Hmm.
optimizing for. We weren't for sale, quite frankly. Our mission was to unlock the power of freelance and share it with the world. And when we saw, thousands of freelancers getting paid, having a meaningful part of their income outside of big urban centers. And we were powering folks that were it was a meritocracy. People that were really good doing their work were able to get access to that work. And we got really excited about our mission. When we were approached to be acquired, what we loved was that it would help us achieve our mission quickly in a really big way.
Right.
When we went
Okay.
through our personal goals of like fun, profit, scale, we're like, whew, we'd have all these resources. As soon as we plug into the mothership, we'll have access to 3,000 clients and building on our 200. So you just kind of like start doing the equation, going through that decision making set, and it's like, yeah, let's do it. Why not? And at the time we were 28, so it's like, all right, we're young. If we can go have a great exit, it's a great first chapter, and we can do it again at some point. So it was a very personal decision for us. And I look
Interesting.
back and I'm proud, but I think that there were also a lot of learnings. And if I were to go through it again, I would definitely, approach things, obviously taking those learnings and doing things a bit different.
Okay. Well, I'd love to learn more about some of those learnings, but what was it like to go through an exit? Like stressful, emotional? How was the process for you?
Yeah, so I'll talk about two things. One is pre exit, while you're going through due diligence and you're trying to run your business as an operator, plus also run a process on top of it. I heard someone describe this. It's a really like graphic analogy, but it stuck with me. You're kind of like standing there naked for a prolonged period of time while everyone's like examining every different square. And we were acquired by Onyx, like one of the largest private equity firms. These guys are good, right? Our due diligence request had like 350 items, and each of those items in the request had like 10 files that were required. We didn't like some of the things that were being asked were totally reasonable if you're buying like a global public company, but in our world, we're like, oh my God, how do we get this together? So it was really stressful, to your point. And
Wow.
but also just it was trying to drive the car while also, give the blueprints of the car and explain how it's working and talk about the 10-year plan. So the two things together it was hard, quite frankly. That's the before. The after I found actually harder. I had spent 3 years pouring my heart, soul, top 5 priorities, not showing up to things into this business. So it was my everything, right? And then to go from it being your everything to being like, someone else owns the keys to the car. Hiring approvals now need to happen. Like all these small things that you're not the mom anymore, right? And
Yeah.
I really struggled on, I'll use the mom and bear analogy. Like I wanted to protect and keep things as they were. And I think that was really toxic. So we actually, like our acquirers, we agreed, we promoted my number 2. She ended up leading the ship. And then I stepped into a more senior role in like the portfolio company that was just totally separate from the business so that I could have impact in another spot, but then also not be toxic, holding back the team of trying to keep things as they were versus growing it to where it was. So I'd say that's probably the hardest 6 months of my career, trying to trying to lead, and adjust, but then also realizing that new normal in a tough way.
And I mean, so just going back to what you said, I could really resonate with that because we had an acquire last year that I spent 3 months going through due diligence around, and the deal ultimately kind of fell apart really close around to COVID, and it was a ride sharing company, and I felt exactly like that. I felt like that naked person that I was. It's a great analogy because it's so true, and people were asking me questions and doing due diligence, and like we had this data room, and it was fucking so stressful. And at the same time, I was trying to run a company, but I generally kind of fucked up because I focused too much on the sale, not on the business and the sales pipeline. So for me, when the deal fell apart, I basically had no sales pipeline, and I had to rebuild one from scratch. And then the pandemic hit; it was like just really bad timing. How did you keep yourself going at that time between the stressfulness of like an exit, but if that fell apart, you got to make sure your company is still running?
I think 2 things. One is that we had a really, really good tight knit circle around us. My partner is amazing, so we would like do our normal build working on the business during the day. He'd come, like Bram's golf, like we would just all hang out, plus also our CTO. We'd stay from like 5 p.m. till midnight doing up the sales stuff. So we basically did 2 jobs, but we had our people there to like help get in the weeds. And I think that it made it fun, right? Like as much stressful as it was like us going at it together. And then the second thing is that we time boxed it. So from when we had our LOI, like the letter of intent, agreeing on the business terms to when we actually sold, that was a very compressed period. And that was by our force. We basically said, this is going to be a giant distraction.
Yeah.
If while we do it, it's going to be short. And if you guys are not interested at the end of that time box, we will be happy to walk away, because what we don't want to do is kind of really impact the business. So I think those 2 things really helped. It made it hard compressing due diligence into a really tight period, but it made it painful shorter versus driving that out.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And a question here I'd love to see if you could answer is what, you said like, the mama bear approach, you're building a company, it's your blood, sweat, equity, you built out all these years. How do you keep yourself motivated after an acquisition?
Honestly, I don't know. I'm just wired to build and achieve and have impact. And it's funny. Someone asked me that question last week. I don't know. I feel like if you're just wired to achieve, it's like that dopamine hit that I'm truly addicted to. And I guess here's something helpful, I guess I'll share, versus just being like, I don't know, I'm crazy and sick. How it's going. But no, I think a more helpful thing is, I believe I've heard people say your career is like a marathon and you just need to chug along and keep going. That does not work for my personality. I'm an interval training girl. So like I go really, 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 really hard for 3 years, and then I chill and go travel or do something for 4 or 5 months. And I go really, really, really hard again, and that's been the pattern. So I've taken 3 sabbaticals in between each career move.
Oh, wow, okay.
I think I need to do it for the reset, the recharge, and it's worked really well for my personality.
Very interesting. Yeah, the sabbaticals. I mean, I one day I'd love to have a sabbatical after exiting this company or whatever happens, but definitely taking time off I think is super critical, which is a good like segue into another question I have is, after taking time off, uh, after exiting with Five Crowd, what did you reflect on? You know, what what were you going through, personally in terms of, okay, what's my next thing I want to do? Where do I want to go and help out? Do I create another company? Do I go help out more startups? And how did you end up at Entrepreneur First?
So I definitely think I'm a lifelong learner, and I'm just very, very curious about everything. And so the biggest thing I reflected on was just wanting to get exposure to more problems, and specifically problems in emerging markets and like global public health.
Yeah.
So during my time off, and people would think I'm crazy. Like I went to really rural parts of like northern Philippines and did homestays. So like I literally
Mm.
just stayed with families, and I found myself last January, like around a kitchen table with these like 5 boisterous ladies that all had like 10 kids, 15 kids, 18 kids. And I'm
Wow.
32, and they could not believe they were about the same age as me that I didn't have children. Like they were just like absolutely flabbergasted by it. But on the flip side, they didn't have access to contraception. And so that's an example of something where why isn't there access to contraception in the Philippines? There's a massive number of people living under the poverty line. Why? And so when you start like understanding people's perspectives, they thought I was crazy. I thought
Mm.
they were crazy. I'm like, you have 15 mouths to feed. How the heck are you doing it? So I think just immersing
Wild.
myself in really different situations. I'm specifically interested in developing markets where there's just really big problems to solve and like if you can have a huge impact, drive building a for-profit business in areas, where you've got some technical background or whatnot,
Mm.
that's what I spent my time doing, like just having stimuli of what's going on in the world. And then why EF? EF actually reached out to me, and I was like, no, I think I want to build again. And then the more I found out about EF, I fell in love with the mission. And I also thought it would be great for whatever I do next, because basically I'm meeting exceptional, exceptional people that come through the program,
Right.
with exposure to all kinds of really interesting problems. And so I thought, what a way to help the ecosystem and help get people, build great companies. And then selfishly
Mm.
at the same time, I check off a few boxes of seeing that great talent, getting exposure to the problems and whatnot. So that's a bit about the journey and then why I chose to come to EF.
Interesting. And so I wanted to ask this before, but um, what tips, tricks, strategies can you tell our audience or our listeners in terms of what founders should really need to be aware of before selling?
Ooh, before selling. Hmm. So I think the biggest thing is making sure you're clear on why the acquisition should happen on both sides, for the acquirer
Mm.
and for your company. And I think if that's super clear and tight, the transaction should work, because you
Yeah.
should all be on the same page, clear on the music sheet that you're all singing off of and running forth. And it should be clear in your mind from a personal perspective what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I think where acquisitions go wrong is when my partner works in M&A, so I see a ton of deals go through on that side. I think when things go wrong, it's when we're actually hitting these 2 objectives. Well, we're actually hitting the 2, maybe even 3 objectives, and there's that lack of clarity. Then all of a sudden, what ends up happening is integration challenges, how all that kind of stuff, and the due diligence gets really
Mhm.
confusing because everyone's DDing that business from all different sides. So
Right.
that's maybe the biggest thing of what to think about. And then I'd say the second thing is have the right partners at the table. We had an exceptional law firm. They were our 911 and 411. It was Bennett Jones, like a big Bay Street firm that were so good to
Mhm.
us. Um, we have the right, iBanker, the right accounting partner. Because if you do, it'll make your life easy. If you don't, obviously it'll be painful. And I've gone through having the wrong partner at one point. I've only ever been in one lawsuit, and I unfortunately had to sue a former accountant for like horribly incorrect financials that cost us a lot of money. So when you have the wrong partners, it's painful, it's ugly, it's terrible. When you have the right partners, they'll just make things better, right? So I guess maybe the two.
Okay, sweet. No, I think you're right. Like we had a challenge with like the partner, the law firm that we brought on as well, and I think it was also a detriment, I think, to the failure of the whole acquisition. So yeah, definitely, I can definitely resonate with that and highlight that that's super, super important to having a good exit. Okay, cool. Wanted to kind of end some of my last questions off in terms of, you're you've been at EF now for a little bit of time. What would you say, aside from everything that you mentioned, want to give you like an opportunity here to really kind of sell EF in terms of how they're a really founder first or founder support driven organization. You covered a lot of great things already in terms of why you're there. Anything else that you've seen as something that, wow, like, EF should really talk about this more, really sell this more as like one of the reasons why founders should choose them?
Thanks for the question. I think that I needed to see it to believe it, to be honest. So now that I've gone through a cohort, I'll just share an anecdote or a case study. We had an amazing single mom who just finished her master's in AI from Queens, applied to the program. She saw an article in the Globe and Mail about us. She's like, yeah, there's people in my network I could found with, but I'd really love to like see really great people. And then we had a recent PhD grad from Mila join us, who was a deep, deep expert in computer vision. They met on week one of the program. She grew up on the farm, so she's like a good old farm girl. And they identified together that there was a huge opportunity applying the CTO's skill set in computer vision to apple orchards. And that if they could do that, they'd be able to unlock massive, massive issues of apples going like having diseases in orchards if they just detected it with the computer vision earlier. And so I guess they applied. Week one, they met each other. They've now raised a significant amount of money, and they've got a huge number of clients that are in their test. And that was they met each other 5 months ago. So I guess the biggest thing for me is like they both said, yeah, there's people I could have founded with, but they just are so happy they found each other because they're just the absolute right complementary people. They enjoy each other. They've got aligned values. And I think what they would play back to us from an EF perspective and why they've been grateful for the program is it's speed to value, speed to valuation, speed to impact in the market. And that's what our internal mission is, to be the fastest path for global winners. So we orient everything we do about speed of the highest potential people so that they can have huge impact, and we could just throw gasoline and catalyze that in any ways.
Fuel that fire. Yeah.
Exactly. Whether it's capital, talent, or customers.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Well, yeah, that's something that I think you could do a great campaign around, that story. Some questions before we wrap up, Rachel. I wanted to ask, with all your experience, and I always like asking these questions because I always get varied responses at the end of these recordings, but what would be advice to yourself, if you were in your early 20s now? With everything that you know now, what would you say to yourself?
I'm going to cheat and pick two. Okay. One, think big, especially being Canadian. Think freaking big. We do not think big enough. What's the impact you're going to have on the world? And I think if we can take the world's most ambitious people and push them to have that kind of perspective, things would be really different. And so I guess now I'm asking myself that question. I wish I pushed early 20-something Rachel with that kind of like really big global scale question. And then the second one, and I think I learned this, but I would reinforce it back to my early 20s, is there's no substitute for hard work. Full stop. Hard work is just what's needed to like push something forward, to have an impact. If you can work 5 times as hard as the person beside you, you're going to be successful, because not a lot of people are willing to do that. So that's probably the second one.
So true for both. I think in the Canadian ecosystem, people don't think large scale enough. It's like what's in my local micro environment, in Canada or locally in Toronto. But I think there's an opportunity in Canada to really, really help a lot of the businesses there, startups, really focus on a very global approach instead of just like one that is national or provincial. So yeah, huge. I totally agree. Last question. What would be your advice to a smart driven founder or, two co-founders who are raising money this year?
There's a lot of capital out there right now, and it's competitive. So there's a lot of capital. The markets are hot. Even with the pandemic, there hasn't really been a massive shift in the funding environment from what I've seen. And so with that, I'd say, the biggest thing you can do is show really good traction with customers. At the end of the day,
Mm-hmm.
if you can present, hey, here's the massive problem I'm solving, and here's the customer's willingness to pay for this solution. It sounds so simple and basic. Like it does. It sounds wildly basic.
Yeah.
However, very few actually do that well. So I guess that would be my advice. Paint that massive picture. Why is this a big market? It's no longer about being a unicorn. It's about being a decacorn. So how are you going to hit your 10 billion
Mm-hmm.
in a massive way, and show some proof points that you're the right people to do it.
Awesome. Cool. Uh, Rachel, it's been awesome having you on our show. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it too.
And for everyone who's listening, this was another Off the Record episode, podcast with the goal of building a community of founders and VCs, investors around so they can help each other build better businesses. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time.